Everybody's heard about the bird. Bird, bird, bird. The bird's a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. The bird's a word. Well, a bird, bird, bird. Well, a bird is a word. Well, a bird, bird. The bird's a word. Well, don't you know about the bird? Well, everybody knows that the bird is a word. Well, a bird.
To a special online panel discussion brought to you by MennoNerds. Tonight I'm joined with an excellent group of panelists hailing from across the United States and Canada as we discuss issues of race, mutuality, and Anabaptist community. On tonight's special webcast, I want to invite you, our audience, to participate right here on Google Hangouts by clicking the Ask a New Question button there on the right of your screen. It's easy. Simply type in a question and click Submit. Throughout the course of the discussion tonight, audience members can like or +1 these questions, and in doing so, we'll have a better idea of which questions are more popular than others when we address those to our panel. You can also join in on the conversation via Twitter. Simply use the MennoNerdsOnRace hashtag that you see at the bottom of my screen, and let us know your thoughts and questions throughout the evening. We'll feature your tweets right here during the broadcast. Finally, for those of you who wish to remain more anonymous with your questions, we'd like to let you know that you can join the BBM channel, MennoNerds, and send us your questions using BBM. Brian Robinson is standing by for all of your Twitter, Google Hangout, and BBM input. So join us as we discuss issues of race, mutuality, and Anabaptist community right here tonight on a special MennoNerds webcast. I'm joined by a fantastic group of panelists this evening. Good evening, panelists.
Good evening.
Hi.
I'd like to introduce you to our audience. Joining us from Columbus, Ohio is Katelin Hansen, the editor of By Their Strange Fruit, an online ministry facilitating justice and reconciliation across racial divides for the sake of the gospel. She serves as director of music at the United Methodist Church for All People, a multi-class, multiracial church in an underprivileged neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. From Philadelphia, joining us is Drew Hart, a PhD student at Luther Theological Seminary studying the intersection of black theology and Anabaptism. Drew is currently a part-time pastor and professor that regularly speaks to churches, conferences, and educational institutions around the themes of discipleship, confronting racism, and Christian ethics. On the West Coast, we have Tim Nafziger of Christian Peacemaker Teams, where he's been a part of the support team since 2008. Tim also blogs for the Mennonite magazine, administrates Young Anabaptist Radicals, and is a part of the Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries there in California. Joining us further north on the West Coast in British Columbia is April Yamasaki, lead pastor of Emmanuel Mennonite Church, a multi-ethnic community in Abbotsford, British Columbia. April's latest book is Sacred Pauses, Spiritual Practices for Personal Renewal, and we're happy to have you on the program tonight. And last but certainly not least is fellow Texan, joining us from Boston, Massachusetts, Osheta Moore, stay-at-home mother, wife, church planner, and naked Anabaptist writer and blogger at shalominthecity.com. Osheta, happy to have you tonight. Welcome to the program. Tonight's webcast will be divided over 3 segments: race and racism, mutuality, and Anabaptist community. I'd like to invite our audience to participate in offering comments and questions throughout Twitter, BBM, and Google Hangouts, as we'll include your thoughts and points along the way. So let's get underway. I want to begin with Drew Hart, joining us from Philadelphia. Drew, quite simply, what is racism? Is it something biological? Is it a social construct? Is it both?
Yeah, I mean, so race in and of itself, it's something that emerged in modernity, and basically it was, so if you think about modernity and the idea of wanting to classify everything and think about everything scientifically, people tried to do that with human beings as well. And so basically people began to classify human beings as though there were different types of human beings. And so it's moving beyond ethnicity to something else, some kind of classifying of people. And so always Western European folk were the most superior type of race, type of humanity, than everybody else. And there's varying stages of how people were understood and classified, but basically, almost always, universally, if you were of African descent, you were at the bottom of the racial pool in a lot of these classifications. But basically, race in and of itself is a social construct. It's not biological. It's something that was made up. And yet, at the same time as I say that race is a social construct, I also insist that race is a reality. it's a lived reality, right? People have been enslaved because of race. They've been raped and violated. People have been killed, discriminated against because of race. So race shapes our everyday life. It permeates every area of our life. I would say that race, I often say it manages us. It tells us where we belong, where we don't belong, what church to go to, what neighborhood to live in. It's unconscious, but it's shaping us and moving people in different ways. And so it's a tool of social management in many ways. So yeah, race, it's a social construct. It's a biologically, it's a lie, and yet it's a lived experience, and it shapes every aspect of our social reality, at least in the United States, and I think probably generally speaking in North America overall.
Well, you touched a little bit about this in that conversation. Let's talk a little bit more about how systemic race and racism is. Talk to us about the issues that disproportionately affect the Black community and how those issues go way beyond just personal biases.
Yeah, I mean, so the tendency is for people to want to focus so much on individual prejudice towards one person, towards another person. And so we define racism based on that. And so then everyone says, I'm not racist because I don't dislike Black people. I don't dislike Latino and Latina brothers and sisters, right? But we don't realize the impacts of how our society is organized in a way that really benefits some people and harms other people. So, for example, I think everybody, and this is almost just common sense, very few people would prefer to send their kids to schools in minority, communities because they know that they're underfunded, right? Most people are not expecting to get, the best, what some people call law and order when it comes to police protection and things like that in inner city communities, because everyone knows that there's a disparity in terms of the kind of services that are being provided. And so we can track statistically whether it be access to adequate housing, education, job opportunities. I mean, we could go on and on and on, and we can see statistically that the way our society is set up is that it benefits some people and harms other people. More specifically, and one of my passions is talking about mass incarceration, because I've seen that even in my own family. I've seen, they say the statistic is 1 out of 3 African Americans in the United States are going to be in the system at some point in their time, whether it be just probation or going through or actually getting arrested and going to jail. In my case, I have 2 other brothers, and so in my case, it's 2 out of the 3 of us have been in the system. I'm the only one that hasn't.
Wow.
So I've seen how that has played out among friends and peers throughout my community. And so, I mean, really, you're talking about almost every single or close to every African American family in the United States. It touches home because so many people, especially African American men as well as Latino, our brown brothers as well, are being terrorized, are being disproportionately, I guess, if you want to take Michelle Alexander's book, she says at every stage there's discrimination, from the policing in the particular neighborhoods, the stop and frisk. It's mostly African American and Latino men that are being stopped. From the actual people who actually get arrested after that, they're disproportionately getting arrested, while a white person who might be getting stopped might get a slap on the wrist and then let go. After that, within the system itself, there's a disparity so that folks, let's say, well, obviously the kind of representation that you're getting, the legal representation that you're getting is not equal. And so often people that are poor are not even, this is on the economic level, able to have the kind of representation needed to actually, defend them and get them proper care.
So these go way beyond personal biases, and it seems like everyone's experience in coming up with these worldviews is different. I want to turn to Osheta Moore in Boston, Massachusetts. Yeah. Osheta, let's talk about your experiences. You haven't always lived in the Northeast, but you grew up in an African-American family there in the South.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your experiences growing up and how those conversations shaped your worldview as a child around issues of race.
Yeah, so I like to say, or I like to think that my dad tried very, very hard to prepare me for the world that we live in, the world that's affected by race, and so he really pressed into me that not so much that I needed to be proud of the fact that I'm African American and that I needed to identify as African American, but that like we're in a post-race society and that we basically I can just pull myself up by my bootstraps and be just as good as white people, and that's the way that I'm going to survive, and that's the way that I'm going to succeed. My husband and I watched Scandal, and so there's this one scene that really resonated with me when Olivia Pope's father is talking to her out in the airport hangar, and he said, "What did I tell you?" And she's like, "You have to do twice as much to have half as what they have." And that's the sort of background that my dad raised me with, and so I never really identified for the longest as African American or tried hard to build relationships with other African Americans. So race was one of those things that I knew I was black and I knew that I had these disadvantages, but I didn't really think about them as much. I tried so very hard to accept that or think that I lived in a post-racial society and try my hardest to do well in school and be successful and have a great career. And that was the way that I was going to sort of overcome these disadvantages that African Americans have. But I think that my dad was short-sighted in the fact that we're not in a post-race society. I will have a harder time trying to have those things, and I needed to acknowledge the fact that I am black and that I am going to have to work harder. So it was almost like it was a very hard thing for me to reconcile. I knew that I had to work really hard because I'm black, but I didn't really self-identify as a black person.
Now, most of that worldview was challenged for you in New Orleans. Tell us a little bit about your experiences there, working in an urban ministry context. How did your experience there in New Orleans change the way that you had been taught to see race and racism? Right.
So, again, I had a very pull myself up by my bootstraps kind of mentality because of my dad, and so there was this sort of unspoken narrative that just laziness or lack of enthusiasm or lack of self-motivation and not necessarily a lack of connections and lack of education and lack of resources and lack of actually seeing that college and a career is a possibility for me or for them. And so when I went on a missions trip to New Orleans and I saw how under-resourced the community we volunteered in. It was a housing development that was nicknamed the Mary Poppins, and I helped out with the children's programming, and I saw that there was just a complete lack of adequate nutrition. There was no parental involvement. Some of the things that the kids would say about their experience in their community or at school was very shocking to me, and it made me question why was this a reality for them, and so then when I moved to New Orleans and actually started doing life, we moved into Holly Grove and opened our home up to the kids in the neighborhood. I saw that in the school system, there's just a complete lack of adequate education and an injustice in the system. We had kids in our home who were in 5th grade but reading on a 2nd grade level, and they were having to make copies of old textbooks that were discards from the other school, and then make copies of those because there wasn't enough to go around. And so, yeah, I think that really shaped my thinking around race, and really shaped a passion in me to see a wholeness around that. How can, as a person of faith, how can I bring wholeness in that? How can I help? And part of it was just becoming aware of the fact that race does play into some major injustices in our world.
That's true. We're going to move in towards the end of the broadcast on issues around Anabaptist community and faith when we're challenged with this reality of racism. Before we go into the next question with Katelin Hansen in Kansas City, I just want to remind our audience that if you are just now logging on to Google Hangouts, you'll actually be starting at the very beginning of our conversation. Down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a bar where you can actually skip ahead to follow us live in case you want to follow us there, or you can just continue to watch it as it's being recorded. So Katelin Hansen, let's move to you in Kansas City. Understanding these problems, even talking about racism can be really frustrating. And your ministry centers around weaving racial justice language and Christian language together to inform communities about these issues. So what is racism to you and what is it not?
Yes, so I think the church has some amazing tools to work at issues of race and racial injustice. And it's unfortunate that so often the church is actually behind in these issues, where we tend to be reactionary rather than prophetic. And we have tremendous opportunity based on our theology, based on Scripture, based on the principles of the gospel, to really lead the way. We have an understanding of both the necessity of reconciliation and justice to go hand in hand. We understand that Easter Sunday morning can't come without Good Friday, that they need each other. We understand ideas of corporate sin, that it goes beyond just what an individual may do, but what a society might do. We have those examples in Scripture. We have examples in Scripture about generational sin and how the consequences of a group's actions live on for future generations. We understand that we have to confess our sins and face our brokenness before we can really receive freedom. And we also understand grace and forgiveness and how all these things go together. We know that guilt might be convicting, but that it ultimately separates us from God and one another, and that we have to move from paralysis into action. And we don't simply sit in a woe is me state about our world, but we can live into our redemption by working for change. You know, how sad would it be if we stuck in the I'm broken and separate from God without going into that next phase of changing one's actions as a result. And so I guess all this to say, the church has a tremendous opportunity to use the language and the skills that we already have in our churches to work on these issues of race and racism. And if we would only live into that, I think we would find that our witness to the world would be profoundly changed. Spencer Perkins, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask you a little bit more, particularly about white people and white communities. Why is the majority community, why are white people so unaware of these systemic issues that Drew talked about, and why should it affect them?
I think we don't have to be aware. A white person can go really their entire life without having to think about race, and that's the privilege aspect. When we talk about white privilege, that's what we mean. That we being white people don't really have to think about it. And so what ends up happening is we consider our white lives as normal, as default, and this must just be how it is for everyone. And it's until we're confronted with that no, this is not what is normal, and the life that I live is as a result of a history and the way a society is structured, such that I benefit over someone else. I think when we're confronted with that, it's very uncomfortable. And so even if we have the opportunity to get into those discussions, we want to back away from them. Again, it's not dissimilar to talking to someone about the gospel and saying, don't you feel like there might be something missing in your life? Don't you feel like there's a brokenness that maybe a Savior could fill? A lot of times there's a knee-jerk reaction to that, saying, no, I'm fine. I'm basically a good person. And I think that's a very similar reaction to, I'm not racist, I'm colorblind. These are very similar knee-jerk reactions that, again, the church has the tools to get beyond.
April Yamasaki up in British Columbia, I want to move to you now. Your experiences are quite unique. Tell us a little bit about your cultural and familial background there in Vancouver.
I find this discussion on race to be very interesting, in part because for me, I tend not to think in that kind of category. In my experience, and I think in the context here where I'm living, talking about race, it sometimes seems too broad of a category. So I think about myself. I grew up, I'm a third generation Canadian from a Chinese background. My husband is third generation Canadian from a Japanese background. And most people would look at us and say, well, you're of the same race because you're both Asian. And that's true if you use that kind of broad category. But the Chinese background and Japanese background, the history has been quite different, to the extent that my mother said to me when I was first engaged to my husband, she said if her father would still be alive, he would not permit her to have a daughter who would marry someone who was Japanese, because he grew up in the context of the war between the Japanese and Chinese. His relatives were in a village in China. They were blockaded by the Japanese and starved to death. So for him to talk about, oh, that's Asian race as if that's all the same, would not have made sense. And so that kind of background has shaped how I understand race. I think I tend to think in smaller categories, so people from specific ethnic or cultural backgrounds. In my congregation, the church began over 30 years ago with a small group from a Russian Mennonite background, and at that time they chose as one of their key verses Jesus' Great Commission to go into the world and make disciples of all nations. And I don't think they realized at the time how prophetic that would be, that some years later, rather than being a Russian Mennonite and others who they had married into that congregation, it's become much broader. I'm there as the pastor, and we have people who are from Kenya, from Vietnam, from other places, and with other ethnic backgrounds. And so that also helps me to think not so much broadly in the category of race, but more specifically in terms of backgrounds and culture and ethnicities. There was one experience we had with someone who was new to the church who is white, but she found that people from the Russian Mennonite background were trying to locate her by who is your family, where are you from? And they couldn't do that because she wasn't related to anybody. And one person finally said to her, well, why are you here in this church? And she looked at them and she said, because of Jesus.
Wow.
And I think that's what we are working toward, that we're here because of Jesus. We're at whatever our background would be, whatever our race would be.
Amen. So it's important to point out that issues of racism in North America aren't pigeonholed to just white and black binaries. Racism can come in all kinds of forms, including benign forms, April. So can you explain to us what model minority racism is and tell us a little bit about your experiences with that?
Well, I connected a lot with what Drew said about, and this was, I think, in the release that went out about this event, that some would say, oh, well, race is no longer an issue. And as I've shared with people here, oh, I'm doing this Google Hangout and it's on race, mutuality, and Anabaptist community, some have said, well, but race, is that still an issue? As if it doesn't matter anymore. But within the last year or two, there was a series of articles in the Vancouver newspaper, which is about an hour and a half from where I live, but it's a major newspaper, and they had a series that was called Racism in Paradise. And it's a city where almost 25%, I think, are now from an Asian background. In Abbotsford, where I live, 20% are from a South Asian background. So there are significant visible minority populations, and we live in harmony with one another for the most part, such that some people would say, well, this is like paradise. But here they had this whole series, I think it was 8 articles on racism in paradise, and they had different people talking about their experience. And one man said he was on the bus, using public transport, and he understood both English and Chinese, and there were 2 groups of people. one exclusively speaking English, one young exclusively speaking Chinese. And the younger ones who were speaking Chinese, they were just laughing and being young and happy. And the other group that were white were talking about them because they couldn't understand their language, and they were assuming that they were talking and laughing about them. And he said it seemed, you know, really odd to be in between there and to hear on the one side people just being people, and on the other side, because of the language barrier and not being able to understand, the assumption that this was something that they were laughing at them. So I think that was an example of the kind of racism that might be that's there, but is not as overt sometimes as we might see in other places, and it's perhaps easier for Canadians to say, oh, but we're not like that. You know, we don't have racism like we see happening in other places. But I think we do have to look at the mirror. For the model minority, I think sometimes people would say, oh, well, the Asians, you know, such a model minority, you work hard, you pull yourself up by your own hard work, and you study a lot, and you make it. And so, well, if you can do that, then there isn't a problem of race, is there? You know, shouldn't everyone be able to do that? But I think that that belies some of the structural racism, some of the inequities, the injustices that are there.
If I could just jump in with that idea of model minority, it's one of these clever situations, again, to put whites in the normal default. As I was referencing, if you think about so many stereotypes for Asians and Black people, they tend to be total opposites when it comes to work ethic, or you know, who's nerdy, who's sporty, who's bold and loud, and who's quiet. And the effect of that is to put white folks in the Goldilocks happy middle ground, the well-balanced, the normal default. So again, it perpetuates those norms by pitting groups against each other.
Yeah.
So if you're just joining us, I want to welcome you to a special webcast panel discussion on race, mutuality, and Anabaptist community, brought to you by MennoNerds. Joining me on the interwebs here are Drew Hart, Katelin Hansen, Osheta Moore, Tim Nafziger, and April Yamasaki. Tonight, you, the audience, can participate in the discussion by offering questions here on Google Hangouts, by submitting them on the right of your viewing screens. To submit a question, simply type your query into the space provided and click Submit. You can also participate on our Twitter conversation using the hashtag MennoNerdsOnRace, and by submitting questions via BBM. Tim Nafziger is joining us in California. Tim, how are you, man?
I'm doing well, enjoying the conversation.
Good. Now, you grew up as a cradle Mennonite in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Goshen, Indiana. And these are two important Anabaptist hotspots that are prominently white. So tell us a little bit about your introduction to issues of racism and white privilege. How did you feel the first time you were confronted with the reality of white privilege?
Yeah, well, I think Katelin's spoken really beautifully to the normalization of what it means to be white. I think for those of us growing up in Mennonite communities with that history, there's an added complication where there's also this history of persecution. You know, Martyr's Mirror is a very prominent book on our shelf. And so that's an added game we can play, if you will, to distance ourselves from white. And in fact, my grandparents and great-parents weren't fully assimilated. There are Anabaptist communities that still speak Low German, like the Amish. But I think Mennonites are still wrestling with or coming to terms with the decision that many made to assimilate and move away from a distinctive cultural framework through speaking Pennsylvania Dutch, and to embrace what it means to be white. And along with that, for Mennonites, comes, you know, Jamie Arpine Reese has asked this question about First Nations people in Canada, and certainly learning the history of my ancestors in Lancaster and the displacement of the Conestoga people there on the land that I was born into and that my family farmed for many generations was very eye-opening. I've written some about that. The moment when I really started to grapple was my first year in college in northern Indiana through the challenge from the Damascus Road program, now Roots of Justice, with Mennonite Central Committee. I think Regina Sham-Stoltz, who might actually be watching this evening, and she was one of the trainers that really introduced me to so many of the concepts that Drew and Katelin and what we've been talking about, of white privilege and looking at systemic issues. So yeah, that's the short answer to your question.
Good. So now you talked a little bit about this, but I want to dig a little deeper. From 2008 to 2011, you were part of a racial reconciliation group at Living Water Community Church that challenged the ways that the leadership structure of your congregation reflected white culture. So can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what you took away from it?
Well, I would say one of the, some background of that is my involvement with Christian Peacemaker teams, starting in 2003 and then as part of the administrative staff. And CPT is an intensive community. Everyone who joins as a CPTer goes through a month-long training that's a real catechist around, especially in the last decade, around issues of racism and looking at issues of privilege and power, and developing a vocabulary to talk to one another about this. So how do we, learning to, as a white person, learning to move past my defensiveness when someone points out something I've said or done that is reflective of the privilege and social location that I carry. There's a great TED talk by someone named Jay Smoove that really speaks to this, learning to listen. So that's background to my experience at Living Water, because I think I went into that setting with some assumptions about a shared vocabulary. And I learned a lot about how we learn things. Katelin really spoke beautifully to the way that repentance and as Christians can be a lens to work around issues of race, but it takes a while to get to that point. And sometimes when we're introduced to anti-racism framework, we can get stuck with this white, not be able to get past the white guilt. It's kind of this, well, yeah, I'm a white person, I'm racist, and we say that, and then I don't know how to get by that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, sorry, no, carry on.
No, go ahead. Keep going. I'm going to turn to Katelin in a moment.
It's about pedagogy. I've learned a lot about how do you share and talk about issues of race and racism in a way that people can hear. Because as April said, a lot of people will say, racist, aren't we done? Are we done with that? You know, Obama's president.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
So, Katelin, let's talk about that just a little bit more. What is white privilege? We may see that phrase used from time to time around issues of race, but what is it, and how do you communicate what white privilege is to white folks?
Yeah, so like anything, there are many aspects to racism, many manifestations. A lot of it is the systemic issues, the things that cause disparity in incarceration, in income, in home ownership, in employment. The list goes on, and those are really real things. A lot of the entry point for white people in even starting to think about race is to think about their own experiences and the little ways in which they are part of this racial network. Again, bringing out of that default mindset to say, you know what, life is a little bit easier, and it has to do with my skin tone. And that can range from really simple things like finding Band-Aids that match your skin to really big deal things like being able to get a job no matter what your hair looks like. If wearing the natural hair on your head that God gave you will not affect whether you're hired or fired, or most recently, for the Army regulations, you can live your life in a way that is privileged. You can count on being able to find a house in a neighborhood that has people like you, that has good schools, and that you won't get harassed for living where you want to live. So there's a whole range of privileges that white folk have, whether we want them or not. And so it's always better to acknowledge them and understand that we have them, rather than burying our heads in the sand and pretending like they don't actually exist.
Drew Hart, your experiences in Philadelphia have placed you squarely in between white and black communities. So as an educator and a student, how do you introduce the construction of whiteness to your community? How does whiteness affect society as a whole in general, and churches more specifically?
Yeah, it's interesting, and one of the things that I've been doing recently is using less of the language that Katelin just used, which is white privilege, and I've been talking a lot more about white control and white domination, because I think I'm trying to articulate and help people understand what the actual problem is. It's one thing to talk about how a society is racialized, and yes, that it benefits some people and harms other people, but to be more explicit is what I've been trying to wrestle with more recently, into helping people understand power dynamics. So just in general, our society is dominated by white people. It's the dominant culture, has control over our society, the politics, the economics, the social access. It's controlled by white people, and that we need to be honest about that reality. And then once we begin to be honest about that social reality, that our society is controlled by the white dominant group, then we can begin to look at different communities and institutions and look at how that plays out. So I'm very interested in talking to communities and having them look at what is actually being practiced, and where can we see that. So you can go to any given church, even churches that would call themselves multicultural and multi-ethnic, and many times you'll find communities still being dominated and controlled by a white group of people that hold all the power, all the decision making, even though you might have some folks on the ground that look different. And so then they're shaping the culture, the tone, the parameters, the kind of style of engagement that's acceptable. It's all being framed around those who have the decision-making power. So I guess for me, that's some of the stuff that I'm wrestling with, is how do we be honest? You know, sometimes we talk about race as though it's a black problem, right? And so all the attention is, oh, well, we got to work, black people got to figure out, how to, take care of these race problems or something. And we've not spent enough time investigating the praxis, the performances of whiteness. What is actually being carried out? How did we even get to where we are? And I think some of it is only by exploring how society is being dominated. I mean, it's the exact opposite of Christ and kenosis and emptying, self-emptying, right? It's the dominating and lording over. And how do we, begin to name and unveil those practices, I think, are the very first step is to acknowledge that it's there, and then we can talk about self-emptying and renouncing and resisting, repenting from those things. Yeah,
Drew, but you talked about culture, but in my church culture, we sing European hymns, and that's just what we do at church. Are you saying that, when we're singing those hymns, or when we're, participating with certain speakers, that is dominance kind of floating to the surface?
When we normalize those things and centralize them and don't realize their own, that they are in of themselves cultural particularities, that everything's a cultural particularity. And so it's very easy when you are the norm to just see it as a neutral act. But when we realize that we do have a global church, the church is bigger than just my tradition or whoever's running things and in control, then we can begin to value and appreciate the different aspects of the church bring into the conversation. But as so long as the white way is always the right way, and that for example, I always use, there's an anti-blackness that goes along with white control, which is why on one hand, racism isn't just black and white. On the other hand, there is the way in which anti-blackness shows up in an extreme form, at least in America. And so when the African American way of singing and gospel music in worship is always characterized as wrong, as silly, as, you know, emotionalism. Then all of a sudden you begin to realize that, you know, all these things are not being taken in an equal way. They're not valued in the same way. And so that, again, the framework is that the white European way is the right way to do everything else. And once people figure that we have the better way of doing it, then they'll be more closer to God and a better form of Christian expression.
So, Osheta Moore, I want to go to you there in Boston. Tell us a little bit more about your experiences, both the positive and the negative ones. When you've had conversations with white persons and persons of color engaging the issues of race and racism, how does that conversation go?
So I think that's a really good question, because I think what usually happens, and what breaks my heart when this conversation is even broached, is that the white person usually says, "Well, I don't want to have that conversation because the white man is always the bad guy, or he's the devil, or you know, I'm not racist," and it's very much like what Katelin said. It's like a very reactive kind of posture, and I think it breaks my heart. The bad experiences I've had, and it's always broken my heart, because I think that the fact that the person of color is asking and inviting them into this conversation is a very beautiful thing. It's a very vulnerable thing, and it's saying, I want to, at some point, I want to be reconciled to you. I want to share part of myself with you because I recognize that there's this brokenness. And so that's the negative that I've seen. And I think that if we can kind of have just the underlying assumption that this conversation is not going to be an us and them, it's going to be a we. How can we talk about this, and how can we create a better story around race? How can we both be heard? I think if that's the underlying posture, then I've seen some really beautiful things come out of that. I've seen just in one example is in my marriage. My husband and I have had a lot of conversations around race, even though he's a white man that really understands African American culture. His background and his story really lends himself to understanding hip hop and African Americans, and he really loves Dr. King, and so he's a really thoughtful person around race. But even then, as a white man, he hasn't had the experiences I've had, and so we've had a lot of conversations where I've had to be really vulnerable, and knowing that he is viewing this conversation as a means to reconciliation and not a means to create a standoff or as a means to start an argument, just knowing that that's the end goal of the conversation has really softened the language and really created this beautiful space to grow. And so I think that is that's my hope whenever I talk about reconciliation is to sort of re-emphasize that the point of talking about reconciliation is not to hash up the hard things and the plight of the African American, and not to like heap guilt on white people. I don't talk about white privilege because I want my white friends to feel bad. I talk about white privilege because I want them to understand my experience, because I want them to know me better. Because as a black person in a relationship with them, if I have to hold that part of myself back, I don't really truly feel known.
That's good. Before we head over to the Twitter feeds, I wanted to talk to April Yamasaki in British Columbia. You're Canadian, so, and as a pastor, how do your experiences jive with these ones that we've just been talking about? Where have you encountered white privilege in your community, and what can you tell us about its worldview from your own experiences?
I think I might come from it from the other side, thinking less about the white privilege part and more about where we are working on reconciliation and being more of a we rather than a us and a them. Still wondering about and still wanting to push on the point of transformation. Just going back to what Drew had been talking about structures and who is in control. When I think about my own congregation and even Mennonite Church Canada, which we're part of as a denomination, I think that there are sincere efforts at including people from diverse backgrounds in the structures, that are part of the decision making. But I sometimes think that there is an underlying assumption there that it will still be a certain way, and that people, whatever their background, will fit into this certain way that has been already there for generations, perhaps. Some might call it white privilege, some might call it the tradition that's being received, but there's something there that people are kind of expected to fit into, and I'm wondering about going further. So as we include people in various ways, then those structures, that received tradition, that should be changing, because the definition of we then is becoming a bigger we. It's becoming a different we, and so it should look differently. So when I think of some of the people from other backgrounds who are part of our worship teams, for example, we've learned some songs in Swahili from our Kenyan brothers, and that's a good thing. That's a transformative thing. But I wonder too, when it comes to the decision making in our committees, our church council, and so on, how does the involvement of people from different backgrounds actually change the way we understand how we work together and our vision together? So I think that's kind of where we're pushing at in terms of the white privilege, white control, white domination thing. Where is the other side of that, and what is being transformed there?
Ryan Robinson's standing by with questions from the audience. I want to remind you that you can join in the conversation using the MennoNerds on Race hashtag via Twitter, where we're already getting a lot of input. So let's go to the audience here on Twitter and see what they have to say. Chris Lynchen asks, do we acknowledge that racism is a reality in church culture? Tim, you want to answer that one?
Can you say that one again? I was actually looking at the questions coming in on Google Plus rather than the Twitter feed. So.
Yeah, so we're going to get to the Google Plus questions a little bit later, but right now we're taking Twitter questions. Chris Lynch, he asks, do we acknowledge that racism is a reality in church culture?
Do we acknowledge? That's not quite sure. There's different ways to take that. I mean, I think it's really important that we do. I think often we don't, for many of the reasons we've been talking about. I think you ask, we talked earlier about my experience at Living Water, and one of the things I learned there was that even in work, doing anti-racism work, as a white person, it was important for me to let go of control. And I had my lenses about that look a lot like what we've talked about in terms of structural racism. And the direction that Living Water has gone is very diverse, very multicultural, but a lot of the leadership has come from immigrant communities where the narrative for them is not one of challenging structural racism, but they're, for a variety of reasons, they're actually trying to assimilate. And so my language and the language that the group I was part of worked with wasn't part of where they were at. And so, since I've been gone from Living Water for 2 years and gone back for visits, I see a congregation that's led by an African choir, made up of immigrants, migrants from different communities in the Great Lakes region of Africa. It's just incredible richness, and for none of them is white privilege or white supremacy or the terms we use central. It relates to a question that Samantha Loy brought up in the Google Plus, just talking about what's the pedagogy. And for me, it's recognizing that there's a toolbox, and that toolbox is shaped both by an analysis, which I think we've touched on a number of times, looking at structural issues. Drew and Katelin have spoken to very well, but it's also shaped by practices. And those practices don't always come through an academic lens. Sometimes they come through very hard and difficult situations that people just learn. I think especially for white people, being in a congregation where they're a minority for an extended period of time. That's been, friends of mine, Dave and Nita Jackson, have learned a lot in those contexts. So that's a significant riff off the original question, but that's where I go when I think of that. Thanks.
That's good. So let's go to our second question. MT Campen asks, let's talk about the intersection of racism and settler colonialism. Second Twitter from Missional says, how do we address the relative silence about First Nations peoples in the U.S. context of this conversation? Who wants to tackle that one?
I'll say something real briefly. In fact, I've had some great conversations with Melanie on Twitter. But yeah, absolutely. I think often, at least it might be different in different places in the U.S., but certainly in the Northeast, Native Americans are almost forgotten people. No one acknowledges anymore that the land is stolen, that this whole project exists primarily because of genocide and stealing of land and displacing people. And I think, and I know we'll get more into Mennonite stuff later and Anabaptist stuff later, but certainly Christians as a whole, the whole church, have enjoyed living off of land that has been stolen. And I think being honest about those histories and the colonization that has taken place is central. Certainly as an African American, it's a little bit more complex that I think about. I was by force, my ancestors by force were brought to a land that was not theirs, and so I think in many ways it's a little bit more complicated, but nonetheless to still acknowledge nonetheless that this land is not ours, and that whole peoples are in many ways near invisible, if not present at all, in many communities, in the Northeast at least. I think it might be different in different regions. But so yeah, anyway, I just think that that's a reality that America, the United States as a whole, has not wrestled with at all. I know people don't even want to talk about the offensiveness of the Redskins mascot and name and logo, nonetheless to take account of actual history and pain and suffering that has gone on for First Nation peoples. Yeah.
I really appreciate this question because just before we went on with this panel, we had a bit of a conversation about that too, and the question highlights for me one of the differences I noticed in having those of you on the panel from the U.S. and then understanding my context also as well, where I think that the questions of Aboriginal people like that, those are seen as racial questions here that I think we need to work on. The one comment I'd have about racism and settler colonialism is that in Canada, I think sometimes though, as much as I think we're trying to work at that, I also find that the conversation tends to be cast as white settlers and Aboriginal people. And then I think, well, for me and for number of Canadians that are not from either of those two groups, how are we part of that conversation? And I think we need to be part of that conversation. For those who are coming to Canada from other countries, I think the narrative that we're receiving is largely that white narrative and not so much the narrative of the Aboriginal people. And I think that's part of the reason that I would say, well, yeah, we're kind of like settler people because that's the narrative that we have been taught as we have come to the country. On the other hand, I know as I've talked with different Aboriginal people, some have said to me, well, Chinatown, that was one of the few places that I could go to and feel like I was a human being. And so in some ways we have more in common with that side of the conversation. And I think that the conversation about race needs to be broader than white settlers and Aboriginal people to include the different cultures that are part of Canada.
Tonight we're discussing racism and mutuality within an Anabaptist context. Thanks for joining me. I'm Tyler Tully with MennoNerds. Let's move to Katelin Hansen in Ohio. Katelin, I want to ask you about microaggressions. What are these invisible things that the white community has a hard time recognizing about race, and how do they pop up even though whites are unaware of them?
Yeah, again, kind of like white privilege, microaggressions is one of those things that white folk can start to wrap their minds around race with. If they're not quite ready to jump into mass incarceration and the war on drugs and the GI Bill and all this really rough history that's created systemic disparity, a good entry point is often this idea of microaggressions, where daily lived life is can be a series of insults, navigating a subtly passively aggressive environment. So those can be things like when you're perceived as too loud or not fitting in or not one of us. These daily lived experiences accumulate in a way that is quite burdensome on your mind, having to deal with these things that white people just don't have to deal with. And it's a day in and day out. Dr. Beverly Tatum talks about racism as a smog that we breathe in daily. And so I think that is in the environment where white people just don't have to deal with these daily things that affect a life for people of color.
Drew Hart, that leads me to you. You've talked a little bit about this, but I want to dig deeper into the conversation of whiteness and the logic used to perpetuate whiteness as normal. So why is whiteness, or how is whiteness a stumbling block to Christian community?
I mean, I think that some of it is just a matter of fact that historically Western Europe, I mean, Western civilization, Western society has blended Christianity with their own culture and society. And so once that happened, once Western civilization and Christianity were conflated as the same thing, it becomes hard to have any meaningful conversation until that is severed. So, for example, I mean, and again, we could go back to colonization and stuff, but I mean, when people brought Christianity, they brought Western civilization. I think that's the same thing that goes on in our local churches. People, they claim to be bringing Christianity, but much of it is also white dominant cultural logics, white dominant cultural preferences, white dominant cultural practices. And so until we can begin to sever Christianity from whiteness in and of itself as the norm and as the proper way of being, as the right way to do things, then I think the church is always going to be struggling with the issue of whiteness being centralized, being normalized, and even theologically I think that's the case. So, you know, I mean, the issue right now is that many folks feel like if you are not walking in step perfectly with some articulation of Western European theology, whether it be Reformed, Lutheran, whatever it is, that in and of itself, you know, you are off the course, and they're the central judges. They're the referees of the theological game, and they're telling everybody else who's in bounds and who's out of bounds. And so I think everything is revolving around white European people being dominant and central and in control of the whole ecclesial life. And so we see that in denominations, we see that in local Christian communities, we see that in a whole variety of ways. But I think it all comes down to the conflating of white culture in America with Christianity. And so even as Christianity is becoming, it's fading away in terms of its popularity, the conflation hasn't disappeared. So that those still see that people will be quicker as Christians, white Christians, to draw from a white person who's not even a Christian than they will from Jeremiah Wright. Why? Because of the conflation of whiteness with Christianity.
Osheta Moore.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pop in because Katelin said something that around microaggressions that I wanted to sort of flesh out a bit, because it is a smog that I live in. I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I'm Black, and I live in Cambridge, which is a very affluent part of the country, and so it is something that I think about all the time, like how am I perceived as a Black person in public with my children. And I had a conversation with a white woman once because she was trying to figure out, like, what is microaggressions, because when we start talking about race, it's thorny, and she's all nervous, like, I don't know I'm always nervous that I'm going to say something wrong, or I don't know what a microaggression is, and so I was sort of just breaking it down to her, like, when I'm out with my kids and someone asks, "Am I the nanny?" Like, that's a microaggression. Like, it's an assumption that you already have because you see a black person with a child that she's somehow the help. Or I wrote a blog post about it after this conversation, just sort of like outlining, like, what does my life look like as a black person? Like, I go into a store and I wonder, are they watching me? And so I just feel like I just wanted to sort of flesh out, like, what does microaggressions look like? What does it feel like? And it is something. It's not something that we make up, and it's not something that we're oversensitive about. I think for me, I've experienced it a lot in my life. Like, for instance, I was once stopped by a security guard at a grocery store because he thought that I had stolen a can of formula that I had taken off the shelf, and just looked at it and decided that I wasn't going to get it and put it back. But formula is usually stolen because it's part of the WIC package, and so he just pulled me over and asked me, and I left the store wondering, would that have happened if I were a white woman with babies in the grocery store? So I think that I just wanted to kind of chime in, like, it is something that we experience even on a daily basis.
Thanks for giving us those examples. That's great.
April, as a leader in Canada, as an ethnic minority leader in the Mennonite church there, what do you say to Mennonites whose intentions might be good? Mennonites who often use parochial phrases and sayings that are white normative. How can white Anabaptists understand better what is being communicated there?
I think that's a real challenge, and I guess I tend to approach that one microaggression at a time, one person at a time, that there's always an opportunity to share from the other side and to help educate people. I was recently at a conference, and I was looking forward to hearing the speaker, but he started out with some comments that definitely assumed that everyone was white Russian Mennonite, and I just felt like I was starting to be shut out of the conversation because he's trying to connect, and I know he's well-meaning, but just didn't seem to realize that there were others who were there who did not share that white Russian Mennonite background. And a few of us at my table, we were kind of rolling our eyes around it. And I said, if we're going to roll our eyes and if we're going to, kind of make comments here at our table, I just feel like I need to go and talk with the speaker at the break. So I did, and when I talked with them at the break and kind of explained, comments and how that came across to some of us and being shut out, his first response was, I'm sorry if you felt that way. And I just, my heart sank because I thought, okay, I'm sorry, okay, that's good, okay, but I just said that was how I felt, that is how we felt, so I wanted more than that, so I just kind of kept talking, and I basically repeated myself using different words, and by the end of the conversation he said, I think I understand what you mean now, and I'm going to think about that for the next time I speak to a group. And I thought that was a great conversation, and afterward people at my table said, oh yeah, do you feel better now that you went and talked to him about it? And I didn't mean to go trying to vent or to be overly critical, because I think this was a person who was a young speaker, speaking to a group for the first time, and I don't know what he had been told in terms of preparation for who he was speaking to and all of that, but I thought it was a good opportunity to connect with someone on that, and yeah, like for the next time, I think he will approach the next speaking event differently, so I'm glad for that. But I think that's part of what we need to do when things occur in the course of our daily life or ministry, to feel that we can address them in a good way, or I can address them in a positive way.
All right, audience, in a few moments we'll be offering our audience's questions to the panel. So I want to invite you again to submit your questions on Twitter, BBM, and right here on Google Hangouts. Don't forget to up one or like the questions that are already in the Q&A query there. But before we head that way, I want to turn again on the issue of working in a part of racialized communities. So, Osheta Moore, recently the MennoNerds hosted a blog series tackling Anabaptist distinctives. And one of those distinctives is our Anabaptist spirit of being agents of God's shalom. How does being an agent of God's shalom transform communities from your experience, and what are some of the pitfalls of well-intentioned white persons who attempt to enter into that work with and alongside persons of color?
Yes. So I think that when I think about being an agent of shalom, I think of it as entering into a situation and looking for the brokenness, looking for the injustice, and then doing everything that I can to bridge that gap, to create wholeness. And so what I have found in the work, primarily in New Orleans, in the work that we did, was I found that listening was a huge step in creating shalom. I feel like a lot of times the conversation can be hijacked when the person of power enters into the conversation and already has like the narrative or the script already written in their head, or they already have an answer, and instead of just not coming from that place that they're used to always like having the final say, but stepping back and listening has been really helpful. My background, because I was raised to sort of not really view myself as black, I really had to struggle with that, with listening to some of the stories that the kids had and really saying, does that really happen? That happens for you? Because I didn't really experience that in sort of my suburban southern city. I was kind of protected by that, I guess, by my dad, or I just didn't really experience a whole lot of racism as a child, but I did see it a whole lot more when we started doing ministry in an urban context. And so I think listening is just a really powerful way of creating shalom, and then being a voice and examining ways to be an advocate in that system. So like my husband worked in the school, and so he learned how to work the system for the students so that they were getting the education that they need, so they were getting the textbooks that they need. And so I think those are really great steps for creating shalom. But I think a pitfall is like this, the white person comes in as the savior, like, oh, they have all the answers and they have all the systems and they have all the experience, and so I'm just going to come in and you're going to do my 5-point plan, and then this whole community is going to be fixed because of my plan. And I think that is a pitfall. In a very well-meaning way, they're trying to create shalom, but no, shalom happens when you enter into the context, learn from the people, learn what they need, and then you, in a sense, feel that suffering, feel that brokenness too, and then you're motivated to create wholeness in a way that makes sense for that community, not the person of power and the experience that you have sort of coming in and fixing it, because that doesn't, it never really helps, and it doesn't really create a wholeness and unity in the relationships, which I think is God's end goal. He wants his people to be unified. He doesn't want one group of people coming in and fixing the problem for them.
Tonight I'm joined with panelists from around the continent discussing race, mutuality, and Anabaptist community. If you're just joining us, we're having a great conversation, and I want to invite you to be a part of it. We're getting some feedback from our audience on Twitter via our MennoNerds on Race hashtag, as well as from our Google Hangouts here. And so I want to address some of these questions that you, our audience, has posted to the panel. Let's check them out. These are some pretty tough questions. I'm really excited that so many people are contributing here. So let's just chop away at it. Panel, many people aim to separate church and state or politics. Yet it seems that political activism is important here. How do you reconcile church and state with the sacred and secular in seeking racial reconciliation and justice?
I can start out briefly just to say that we see, I think the fact that Sunday morning is still so segregated shows us that we can't necessarily legislate issues of the heart. So it is extremely important for governments to put in laws in place to protect people, but when it comes to what folks choose to do, that's really where the church needs to step in to talk about these issues of the heart and what we want to do, what the kingdom would have us do beyond what the law says we're simply obligated to do. And don't get me wrong, those laws are very important to protect folks. But when it comes to what we want to do for the sake of Christ, that's where the church really needs to step up.
Can I add? So, I mean, the way I say everything is political. And so, in some way or form, you know, everything is politics. To say nothing is a political move. So the question is, what kind of politics are we engaged in? And so, I think that, again, so I don't think the option is, are we going to use the state or not use the state? And those are the only options. I think that's the options of the American citizen, to use the proper channels given to you or nothing at all. But I think because we, as Anabaptists especially, as we'll get there, right, we talk about being followers of Christ, we have a whole new set of options available to us as Christians. And so Jesus himself, especially in the Gospel of Luke, he set himself towards Jerusalem, right? Starting in like chapter 9, and from that point forward, he's always on his way to Jerusalem. And when he gets there, it's a big clash, and it's a confrontation. You could say it's a political confrontation, and so we're not bound to the options that were given that are given to us through citizenship. We don't have to only worry about going through those proper channels, but we can engage in a whole variety of political activism and confrontation. And I think it's necessary. And I think looking at the black church, for example, I mean, we are where we are today precisely because the black church has engaged in faithful political action that reflects the kind of life of Jesus and the prophetic witness that we see throughout Scripture. And so I think we need to be much more creative and have a kingdom imagination for the possibilities of engagement in our worlds. But I don't see ourselves, I don't think we want to get to the point where we're trying to recreate Christendom and run things. I think we engage society as the church, as the called out ones within the empire, and then we clash with it at times if necessary, or we have a prophetic voice when necessary. But I think that we have way more options than just merely working through the state to engage in political activism as Christians and followers of Christ.
Preach it.
All right, next question. I've heard Christians cautioning against moralism as opposed to biblical truth. For them, it's to focus on and fight for multiculturalism would fit under moralism. Any advice on how to discuss this topic as a part of God's compassion and not just PC morals?
I was just part of a webinar last night with Ched Myers on Pentecost and how this is right at the center of what the Spirit is doing with the tongues. I can't summarize all the points, but just really commending that passage and some deep Bible study around it as a great way to think about how this work flows out of at the center of the church, not something that's an add-on. Because I think as long as we see it as an add-on, then you're going to come up against this again and again.
I think, too, when I see the example of Jesus in the way he related to people, both within the Jewish community and beyond that, that's already an example for what reconciliation among people of different backgrounds and races could look like. So when I think of his example and I think about creation, when people were created for relationship with God, to relate with one another and to the earth, I mean, there is a picture already from creation and then right the way through Scripture to the example of Jesus and the experience of the early church that people were called to come together. And I think that the specific issues might change over time. So for the early church, it was Jewish and Gentile. That was the divide that came together, and Ephesians said that the two became one. And I think today, perhaps in the U.S., it might be primarily black and white in particular contexts. There are other ethnic group, other races as well. You know, in Canada, it might be different around the world in different countries. You know, the racial questions and issues might be different in that context. But the vision to be a whole people, all created by God, that is a vision, I think, that is for all of us around the world. And it's at the heart of the gospel as I think about Jesus' call to say this is a new kingdom and it's a new way of life. There is forgiveness and power to be a new creation. So that's where I would locate it, not so much in moralism or in some kind of politically correct values, but in creation and in the heart of the gospel and the example of Jesus.
It's as if we could separate the example of Jesus as some type of moralistic living aside from God in the flesh.
Right.
The third question, I work with leaders of leaders, pastors and those who pastor pastors. I'd like to hear more about the pedagogical insights Tim alluded to, and from any panelist. Do folk have biblical passages you return to in teaching this conversation?
One passage that's been really important for me is the story of the Syrophoenician woman, and was introduced by my CPT colleague Carol Rose to thinking of that as an example of Jesus really listening with humility. Jesus uses actually a slur when talking to the Syrophoenician woman, refers to her people as dogs, and she comes back and says, no, challenges that, and Jesus then doesn't just listen passively, but actively goes out and says and acknowledges her point. And I think that for me is it's a theme from this evening, is listening and then changing. And I think others have talked about how important it is that especially as white cradle Mennonites, when I'm part of structures where I feel normal, where it feels comfortable to me, that I not assume that people of color, indigenous people will enter into those settings and just assimilate, but that the structures themselves change.
Anyone else?
There's probably no one particular passage that I go to, but excuse me. I think, obviously, Good Samaritan. I think that in general, the story of the life of Jesus and immersing ourselves in the life of Jesus opens us up in a whole variety of ways. And so if we keep track of Jesus and how he engages with the Samaritans and the marginalized women, I think that all of a sudden you begin to see that Jesus himself always keeps his eyes open towards those who are being marginalized, especially the outcasts ethnically as well. And so I think that just the stories of Jesus themselves, if we were really to immerse ourselves in those stories and allow them begin to embody the life and story of Jesus itself, I don't understand how you can follow Jesus and not keep track of the ethnic and racial tensions that are going on around us. I feel like to ignore those things, to close ourselves off to those realities, is to not really truly be following Jesus.
Tonight we've discussed issues around race. What is race? What is racism? And how do we react to privileges and oppression centered upon race? How do these realities systemic and not only biases? I'm joined by Tim Nafziger, April Yamasaki, Osheta Moore, Katelin Hansen, and Drew Hart tonight on a special webcast produced by MennoNerds. Panelists, we're getting some really, really good feedback from our audience as we tackle these very important issues. Drew Hart, I want to come back to you again. You've recently been delving into how the Mennonite Church has responded to race and racism in the past, specifically in the 20th century. Can you tell us a little bit about your research there and how those experiences compare with other traditions?
Yeah, so what I've found is that the Mennonite Church in the early 20th century, while they were still using a lot of the rhetoric of nonconformity, found themselves, excuse me, my throat is killing me, found themselves really fully assimilated into the logics of the white dominant culture, using a lot of the same rhetoric, a lot of the same biases. And so the language of nonconformity hadn't helped them at that point to actually resist not being patterned after the racial logics and racial practices of American society. But what I found was that, so moving through the 20th century, obviously, you got Harold Bender and was it 43 with the Anabaptist vision. But then in the 50s and 60s, you begin to see Mennonites paying attention to the civil rights movements in the black church and some of the activism that's going on. You see them paying attention to Martin Luther King and needing to take him seriously, not sure what to do with him because here's this guy that's nonviolent, but he's clashing with the forces and he's engaged in political activism. And at that particular time, many Mennonites were still wrestling with the issue of resistance and thinking that non-resistance was the way to go. And so they didn't have a theological praxis for engaging injustice. Then, of course, and we just lost a great hero, but Vincent Harding went to task as a part of the Mennonite community at that time, really challenging them to get engaged and to, put this Anabaptist witness, put some boots on the ground. And so he gave himself to the Mennonite church over and over again, pleading with them to get engaged and to be politically active and to, to live out that 16th century witness, but here in the presence alongside of African Americans who are being marginalized, who are now the defenseless in America. And so the Mennonites, even though he ended up leaving the Mennonites out of frustration, the Mennonites actually in many ways have learned a lot from the civil rights movement and the nonviolent direct action that was going on in the black church. I mean, I would argue that, much of what we see today in the Mennonite church in terms of the activism that, you hear much more language of active rather than passive language of peacemaking and doing justice in the Mennonite church now. And a lot of that is reflected of at least partially some of the influences of folks like Vincent Harding and Martin Luther King that they had on the Mennonite church. And so there is this, especially in the Mennonite church, a much more intentional language of undoing racism that you hear going on, at least at the denominational level. In certain pockets of the Mennonite church, you see that as well. What we don't see is, and what I'm curious about how that's going to play out is, as the popularity of Anabaptism is growing from folks who are coming outside of historic Anabaptist communities, we're not seeing that those lessons learned through the 20th century. And so a lot of neo-Anabaptists are coming, but they're coming with all the evangelical baggage, and they're not taking seriously, I think, a lot of the historic Anabaptist lessons that they've learned through the 20th century. So they're starting from scratch, and a lot of them are not. They're closing off to issues of race and racialization and white supremacy, and they're even more situated often within dominant culture, and they're not asking those tough questions. So I think that there's a lot that the neo-Anabaptists can learn from the lessons that some of these historic Anabaptists have learned through the 20th century, that at least can put them in a place where they can take seriously their social location, take seriously the social realities and the history that have gotten us to this place. Until that happens, I think that Anabaptism in American society, I mean, it's going to continue to, I've been saying, to be a failure. In terms of the mass movements, I think there's always been Anabaptists that have been faithfully living this out, but I think that in many ways we see there is a tendency to close off and just talk about discipleship and talk about the church and ecclesiology in a social vacuum, as though we don't live in society and not place ourselves within a racialized society, in a society dominated by white people and controlled by white people, to not take seriously the legacy of history, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and lynching and discrimination and all those things. And so I think that the Mennonite church, what it has learned, it's still got a lot of lessons to learn as well, but I think it has begun to wrestle with those questions and take them seriously, and I'm hoping that the whole Anabaptist stream can begin to do that as well.
Katelin Hansen, what is racial reconciliation? Is it even possible? What do we mean when we speak about reconciliation?
Yeah. So I think what people mean when they say reconciliation is restoring that biblical ideal of unity with one another. But I think it's important to remember that as we do that, we have to confront and undo all the things that drove us apart to begin with. And so that's really where that marriage between justice and reconciliation has to happen. This moment of perfect justice and perfect reconciliation going hand in hand, and it's through that we have hope of a restored relationship. To be reconciled with one another means that the disparities that separate us have been uprooted and altered so that we can be on good footing with one another.
We've talked about new and ethnic Anabaptists here tonight, most of which are white. So, Katelin, where do we go from here? How do we go beyond white-centered racial awareness? And how or should white folks participate as being allies to persons of color without coming across as saviors or martyrs?
Yeah, that's a really important issue. Learning about responsible white allyship, and really what that means, how can white folks participate, or even should they participate in this work? I think we touched on it before that listening before anything else. A lot of times white folks want to be fixers and doers, and sometimes that can help us feel better about our own guilt. But it can perpetuate that white-centeredness, and also discussions that tend to focus on white education or white racial awareness, again, recenters the whole conversation around white feelings and white personhood, rather than getting at some of the systemic disparities that are in place. And so to some extent, white folks really need to take a back seat and listen and plug into what is already happening. That's not to say that white folks don't take action to uproot these systems. We do. If we don't, we're just like a new convert that changes nothing in their behavior. But knowing how to do that in a responsible way, where we're quietly doing the heavy lifting, listening to see where we can be helpful, addressing our own white sisters and brothers, questions and ignorance, so that we can help bridge those gaps and allow good work and action to move forward. It's about learning how to speak up without speaking over, to avoid that sort of white saviorism that just perpetuates supremacy and hegemony.
Right. I would just want to add to that
and again, to perform labor of educating white folks, and even to the point of significant personal detriment, so that people of color that are already doing the good work can do that with more agency.
Osheta Moore up in Boston.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The feedback froze, so I thought Katelin was finished. But I just wanted to add on to that, because that's really powerful what Katelin said. But I think logistically, like, what does that look like? I think that a lot of times we talk about racial reconciliation or having these conversations, it's very esoteric. But we're like, okay, so the nitty gritty, what does this look like? And I think, really basically, just be afraid to ask the questions that make you feel stupid. Just what does it really do when you go into a store? Do you feel this way? Or when I say this, how does that make you feel? Or gosh, tell me about one time that you felt less than as a black person. Just asking the questions that I feel like white people who are thinking about racial reconciliation, their hearts are in the right place. And I think they're already sort of mulling over, like, what does that look like? And they have questions, but they're afraid to ask the questions. And I think the questions are the important part before the listening. Like, ask the questions that make you feel uncomfortable. Because I think a lot of times when you come to the conversation like, oh, I already know, or you sort of come from your place of power and not really willing to be humble and be vulnerable in the conversation, I think that breaks down reconciliation. So just ask and then listen with an open heart about what we say, and don't try to fix it right there in that conversation, because there's been over 300 years of oppression. We're not going to fix it in a 30-minute conversation, but you will speak some healing to some hurt in my heart in those 30 minutes that will help bring deeper reconciliation in me and in my community. And so I think that's just the nitty-gritty. Just ask questions, and if you have a black friend, like, seek them out. I think we sort of kind of function, we do want to function like, oh, we're past that. Obama's president. Look at Oprah. Like, we want to we want to be past that. But if you have black friends in your life, ask them these questions and be open to what they say, and just sort of let the Holy Spirit take it from there. I think that is just the entryway to racial reconciliation.
One thing just to add on to that, Osheta is being really generous with her time and her willingness to share her stories. But I think it's also really important for white folk to take responsibility for their own education and to avail themselves of just the hundreds of years, literally, of wonderful literature, to read both past and present, and not be necessarily dependent on people of color to help catch us up and get us to where we need to be. I'm profoundly grateful to the sisters and brothers of color that have helped educate me, that really, I mean, changed my life, and I'm very grateful to them. If I, though, require them to constantly perform that labor, then I'm also not doing my job as a white person to help educate my sisters and brothers, and to some extent to get beyond this awareness cycle and to undermine some of the systems at play. At some point, it's going to have to be about white people turning down the promotions, turning down the speaking engagements, turning down the book deals, and to tell the gatekeepers why we're doing that, because we want to hear more voices of color, more visibility for people of color, to really get beyond awareness and go to structural change. That's the sort of personal sacrifice that it will take, and quite frankly, it's the sacrifice as Christians that we're called to do, not as saviors, but as partners for justice and reconciliation.
Tim Nafziger, you're part of the leadership team of Christian Peacemaker Teams International. And you've also spent a good deal of time in the UK with Neo-Anabaptists and have been an advocate and a student of reconciliation and undoing oppressions. Tell us a little bit about understanding what it means to be an Anabaptist, whether old or new, in participating with and alongside persons of color to undo these oppressions.
Well, thanks. While I think about that, can I just yield to April? April said she had something she wanted to say yet, so maybe if she wants to share, and then I'll think a little bit about your question.
Sure, April.
Thanks, Tim. I was just thinking, as both Katelin and Osheta were talking, how I love what you say about really listening and asking good questions, and also the idea of sacrifice and giving up some things as partners, just toward the end there where you were talking about that, Katelin. Because I had been thinking too about not only listening but also taking action. And so I appreciate, Tim, that you noticed that I wanted to speak to that and provided space for that. I think that's one example of partnership. I know a friend of mine, when we were going to school, and she was at that time in her late 20s, she said that she had gone with a group of other white students, just a few of them, and they had gone to a black church, and she shared with me that experience afterward, and she said, it was the first time in my life that I've ever felt like a minority. And I thought, wow, you're in your late 20s. It's the first time you felt like a minority. It would be good for people to experience that, not that they can experience the kind of oppression or history that people have lived through, but even taking that risk to be in a different place, to experience something that you haven't experienced before. I think that's also a step to reconciliation that we're talking about.
That's good.
Tim Nafziger.
Thanks, Tim. I think you want to continue with that other question.
Yeah. Can you ask it again, Tyler? Thanks.
Sure, Tim. We were talking about your time in the UK. I'm curious, when you communicate with Anabaptists, whether they're new or ethnic, how do you communicate with them about participating with and alongside persons of color to undo these oppressions?
I think, for me, as coming from a Mennonite background, one of the important things I can do is try to look at some of these stories that Drew has alluded to and be honest about Mennonite history and not gloss over. It's really easy for neo-Anabaptists to put Mennonites up on a pedestal, and that's dangerous for any number of reasons. One example that I came across, I was looking at some of the stories of Vincent Harding interacting with Mennonite leaders in the 60s that Drew was talking about, and there's a moment in there where Edgar Stays, who was a Mennonite Voluntary Service Director at the time, that compared the civil rights movements to World War II. And he said, you know, Mennonites didn't participate in that, but showed up afterwards to clean up. And he said, Mennonites, quote, declined to participate in the interracial conflict, but seek rather to bring reconciliation and goodwill. And that's a really problematic sentiment. And we might say, oh, well, we've moved beyond that. But if it can actually be a learning opportunity, I think, in the conversation between people coming to Anabaptism and those who have grown up in it, to say, hey, you know what, Mennonites really didn't get this right. We tended to see ourselves as outside the system, and therefore we've tried to ignore our social location. So another example is that Mennonites often tell the story of how there was Jacob Hostetler family who was attacked by Native Americans. They refused to fire back and were kidnapped. It's a story of Mennonites as victims. And they don't talk about the Conestoga Massacre, which happened 250 years ago last December in Lancaster. Now, Mennonites didn't commit the massacres, but we were in the community, and we benefited hugely from taking over Conestoga land. And that invisibility is something that we need to wrestle with openly. Now, this isn't regarding racism, but I think the discussions around John Howard Yoder's legacy very much touch on this too. How do we not see that as something to move past, but an opportunity to go deeper around issues of sexism and patriarchy? And I think there's a lot of similarities that can be part of the conversation between and among people drawn to Anabaptism, both those cradle Mennonites and people joining, who I think are really the future of the Mennonite Church. It's not us legacy Mennonites or whatever you want to call us. It's people drawn to this tradition and embracing it and watching the Spirit move.
Tonight we're wrapping up our MennoNerds panel discussion, but there's still time to submit your questions via Google Hangouts and Twitter using our hashtag MennoNerdsOnRace. Please send in your questions now, as we'll have some time towards the end of the discussion to tackle some of the issues that you, our audience, bring to the table for our panelists. As we conclude our special webcast on racism, mutuality, and Anabaptist community tonight, we want to offer our panel some questions from the audience, but before we do, I'd like to specifically mention a few people behind the scenes tonight who are responsible for putting this unique and helpful MennoNerds discussion together. I'd like to thank Ryan Robinson and Robert Martin for their technical expertise and guidance throughout the process. I'd also like to embarrass Chris Lynchin, who is responsible for organizing this ordeal and helping us put the pieces together. Thanks to all who helped make this a success, including you, our viewing audience. Let's not waste any more time, panel. I want to address some of these questions from our audience to you. They're still coming in, and we will be posting to them here to you as we get them. First question, Andrea asks, black culture is a term that makes me uncomfortable using because I feel as if I'm grouping black Americans and assuming many or majority act and live in a certain way, meaning stereotypes and lifestyle. Am I missing the point? Confusing it? What is it? So what is black culture, and is it okay for white people to throw that label around?
I'll say, in general, it's probably not very helpful for people in dominant culture to talk about black people, just especially because there is a way of people already treating us as a block, as though we're monolithic, as though we think the same way, as though we've had all the same experiences. The reality is that the black community has always been a diverse entity. That said, though, I mean, there are some certain characteristics in terms of experiences of what it means to be a racialized body, to be a black body, something that is done to you, that begins to be popular. And so, I mean, in Philly, I mean, I think it's probably around 50% of, black men have been in the prison system, right? So there are certain elements, certain characteristics, certain things that are common within the neighborhood that are, that I think are familiar to many people. Certain expressions and foods and histories and legacies and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, there is so much diversity. So I would recommend most people, especially someone coming from dominant culture, to not be worried about talking about black culture in some kind of monolithic way, because most likely you're going to already be being presented something from the media, something monolithic that doesn't really represent actual lived experiences on the day-to-day. That's my gut. Yeah.
All right, next question. Drew talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the broadcast, but I want to ask the rest of the panelists. Regina asks, some folk who are engaged in working against racism, myself included, have shifted from the language of white privilege to the language of practices that support the notion of white supremacy. What are your thoughts?
I think on one level, terms like white privilege have become hackneyed, or they lose their teeth sometimes through overuse, and obscures this idea of a very real system of dominance that is perpetuated in our society. And so, although that particular phrase I haven't necessarily had as much familiarity with, I can see advantages with it in that it reshifts the frame and the narrative back to that idea of white supremacy.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, I think that the emphasis on practices is very helpful versus white privilege in and of itself. It's like, so you tell somebody, I'm privileged, and they're like, oh, well, is that a bad thing? Is it a good thing?
Yeah.
I thought privilege was a good thing, and so I don't think people even know what to do when, even if they come to the point where they're like, oh yeah, I have white privilege in America. What do you even do with that? And it tends to often, at that point, begin to just move from becoming aware of white privilege to moving into white guilt, and then it's like this cycle of feelings, and you're just stuck, and everything is centered around white people just exploring their experience, and it doesn't necessarily shift towards a new praxis. And I think as Christians, if we're committed to repentance and turning towards Jesus, then it has to be praxis-oriented, and it has to be moving us beyond just some kind of self-reflection and awareness of some kind of state within society, and towards how do we follow Jesus more faithfully now that we're aware of the realities of our society.
All right, we've got a couple of other questions here. Shifting a little bit theologically, two questions that are very similar when posed to the panel. If racism is acknowledged to be a systemic and ongoing set of practices, more than a kind of individual event, how do majority cultures and non-majority Christians attempt to recast the theological language that has been used in oppressive ways? Is it a liturgical issue? And the next question, which is like it, interrogating and transforming church practices so as not white dominant, but is this simultaneously a cultural and theological question? How do our cultural worship practices and overt theologies interact and affect each other towards non-dominance?
Yeah, I'll jump in at least briefly in the idea that, you know, even in the best of circumstances in multicultural, multi-race churches, we see the inertia of racism and white hegemony coming in even in these best of circumstances. So Corey Edwards writes a book where she profiles a church in Chicago that has everything going for it as far as being a multiracial church, and characterizes how in their music, in the length of the service, in the cultural norms, even though they were more in the middle than a white church would be, the tendency for white hegemony to move in, even in a setting where there was a black lead pastor, where the the majority of the people in the church were black, the white cultural dominance still tended to move in. And so it means we have to be mindful of our leadership. So often in multicultural churches, there will be an assistant or associate pastor of color, but a white, often male, lead pastor, or maybe the musicians are black, or the youth leader is Asian, but the lead pastor is still white. What is the length of the service? Is how often does the choir sing? Is shouting and praise breaks considered disruptive or affirmed? And so getting at these norms can help shift the idea of what is default. If we can reframe that, you know, rather than, you know, gosh, that clapping and that shouting is so distracting and weird, to then look back at white culture and say, gosh, you say you love Jesus, but you're sitting stoically and silently in your pew. How can you say that if you really love Jesus, you'd react? And so reframing some of these things so that the white dominant culture is not what's considered normal. In very practical first step ways, the way you collect offering, who is your leadership, who do you socialize with outside of the church setting, can be some of those ways to subvert the white supremacy and work against the hegemony that, quite frankly, there's just a lot of inertia, and even the most well-intentioned have to be constantly on top of it with intentionality and persistence to work against, again, Dr. Tatum's moving sidewalk, to go against those things.
All right, these two questions are getting at the same root problem. Jamie asks, how do we avoid stepping back and listening as becoming an excuse for not getting engaged? And similarly, at Redeemer, Rachel says, speaking up without speaking over white saviorism, logistically, what does that look like? So, panel, there's kind of this tension between being an ally and kind of dominating the discussion or the praxis in seeking reconciliation. So how do you find balance there in that line for the majority community?
For me, one of the key, there's listening, and then there's developing a lens. Like, how do I learn to see things differently so that it's not just up to Drew or it's not just up to April to name my dynamic, but that maybe I can notice something that's going on. And that's a long process. For me, I've learned a tremendous amount in the last 6 years in my work with CPT, just about I guess it's been, I guess, find formational spaces. It's a, you know, those formational spaces will come in different places for people from the dominant culture. But I do think that in the long term, it's not just about stepping back, but it's about noticing, naming, and acting in ways that are trying to be in solidarity with.
Osheta Moore, do you have anything to add? When we're looking at people who want to be allies, how do we avoid in our Christian communities, how do we avoid taking a step back as being an excuse for really not getting our hands dirty?
Yeah, I think, and I'm looking for the exact quote because there's this quote that I really love by the Christian Community Development Association. But the gist of it is that you enter into a community and you examine the community, and then you look for ways to help the community. And then, but of the best people that do that, the community would say that they brought that wholeness themselves, like that they did it themselves. And so I think that what happens usually with white saviorism is when you come in with your own expectations. Hold on. Oh, my husband just sent it to me. Great. The quote itself is, go to the people, live among them, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build on what they have, but of the best leaders, when their task is done, the people will remark, we have done it ourselves. And it's an ancient Chinese proverb on the community, on CCDA, Community Christian Development Association. And so I think that that's one approach to sort of combating this idea of white saviorism is actually listening. I think we've used that word a lot, but actually learning and loving them, starting with what they know and building on that, and empowering them to say, like, we did this, and not that the person who came in did this for me. I think that's one way to start.
All right, we're going to take one more.
I'm also still thinking about the earlier comment about the change in language from white privilege to practices that support white supremacy. And in this question, I think of it the other way. What would be the practices then that support those who are within the community and working toward racial reconciliation? So this idea of listening and being supportive and building on that would be very important.
If I can just add in, I think one of the exciting points is when there's this quote from Lila Watson in the Aboriginal community in Australia that gets quoted a lot, but I think it's a good one. You know, she and the community say, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time, but if you've come because your liberation is caught up with mine, then we can work together. For me, that's a aha moment for me as a person from the dominant culture. When I start to see how my liberation is called up, it's very exciting. It flows past the guilt that might be a starting point or as part of it, and really is a compelling reason to engage as I experience some of the openings that authentic relationships bring.
All right, I've got one final question here for Drew Hart. Drew, you and I are friends, so we've talked about this a little bit, but I know you've put a lot of thought and work into this subject. I'm going to ask you a really important question, and I know you've got something to say to us here. What does historic Anabaptist community and what do the newcomers, the neo-Anabaptists, have to learn from historically oppressed and marginalized theologies, and how do we bridge that gap using the scriptures?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, I think first and foremost, it's to think about the fact that, Anabaptism from its very origins was about a community on the margins. It was a community trying to follow Jesus, trying to live faithfully on the margins, and they were persecuted, they were displaced, but they were also, caught up in the frustrations of the economic disparities and the oppression and peasant rebellions taking place, and Anabaptists were all intertwined and intermixed with all of that. obviously since the U.S., coming to the U.S. has been a change of social location for Anabaptists in general, and so it's moving from the margins to sometimes being, for a while, the quiet of the land, right, and trying to pretend like there's not complicity in what's going on. But the reality is that to be on the lands, to be on the heels of those who are displacing Native Americans and enjoying those lands is to be complicit. To be silent and to ignore the slavery that was going on was to be complicit. And so there's been a change, and now, I mean, most Mennonites, Brethren in Christ, Church of the Brethren, they're largely middle class, wealthy, well-to-do folks, Neo-Anabaptists as well. Most of them are coming from middle class dominant culture. And so the discourse of Anabaptism is a marginal discourse, and that has remained, but yet people are pretty much tied up in a dominant cultural social location. And there hasn't been honesty about that change of social location, but there has been a change in terms of ignoring and looking away from some of the social realities that are going on all around us. Theologically then, and this, I draw on other folks. So Hubert Brown in the 1970s wrote a book called Black and Mennonite, and he challenged the Mennonites. He said, if you want to become Mennonite for real, Anabaptist, if you want to restore and recover your Anabaptist vision, then you need to engage black theology and the black struggle, and you need to take serious the black power movement that's going on. Here's a challenge that if you want to become Anabaptist and regain this marginal movement, then you're going to have to be in solidarity with those who are also marginalized concretely now. So I think that the Anabaptist movements can be most authentically Anabaptist when it, just like Jesus, identifies with the least of these, identifies with the Samaritan, with the marginalized women, with the poor and those who are hungry. And when Anabaptists begin to really take that seriously, I think that there is a way in which a truly Anabaptist witness that is really much more in continuity, not static in the sense that it looks like what was going on in the 16th century, but in continuity with that kind of movement of following Jesus concretely on the margins of our society today is possible. But again, that takes, again, being immersed into the story of Jesus in a way with our eyes open to society, not closed off and ignoring it, but reading Jesus' story, embodying it, and then making that story visible. And so imagine what it would look like for us to make the story of Jesus visible now, if it's not the Samaritan, but it's the African Americans, the brown and the black and the Latino folks who are being discriminated at atrocious rates. I think that we have an opportunity to bear witness in a highly racialized, highly white supremacist society, which United States is. We have an opportunity to really bear witness to a whole nother way of living. And that's what the kingdom of God is all about. That's what God's church is supposed to be. It's a reconfiguration of social realities, something that only can happen because God has broken into our world and the Spirit of God is moving and doing something amongst us that is unexplainable otherwise. And so I think we would open ourselves up to the Spirit of God and really follow Jesus and make that story of the story of Jesus visible and embody that in our own lives. I think the Anabaptist witness can be really an exciting thing for the 21st century.
All right, as we're wrapping up, April Yamasaki, any concluding thoughts as we wrap up our conversation tonight?
Well, I really appreciate this conversation. It's been wide-ranging, and yet I think there's a lot more that we could cover. So I look forward to continuing the conversation in different ways. Some of us have talked about doing a synchro blog on this. I think there will be more conversations in our own contexts, and I just look forward to that. Just before we began this panel, there was a little bit of an exchange on Twitter about another conversation that had to do with race and race issues. And I had a brief look at that on Facebook, and then I commented on Twitter, I'm glad that we're going to have a different kind of conversation here. So I just want to say that I appreciate each one. It's been inspiring to me and learned a lot, and I look forward to more as we continue this.
Katelin Hansen up in Ohio.
Yeah, I think a lot about what Spencer Perkins said in the book More Than Equals. Just to paraphrase, he asks, can people of color tell the difference between white non-Christians and white Christians when it comes to race? And if they can't, what does that say about our Christ? And really living into the consequences for what that means when white Christians are more part of the dominant society than they are in the body of Christ.
Osheta Moore, final thoughts.
Yeah, my final thoughts are, I've been so thankful for this conversation, and I agree with April. It has been a very different, we've been having this conversation in a very different way, and it's been really life-giving. I think my final thought around racial reconciliation, and I think what I think about a lot, my husband and I have thought about church planting, and we've thought about, like, what is it, how do we have a church that's diverse, and how do we create space where reconciliation happens? And I think the bedrock of it is we just have to acknowledge that this is going to be hard, and that it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable to hear things about someone's experience with racism. It's going to be uncomfortable to have a worship service that leans towards the less dominant culture. But I think that's the essence of a self-emptying love. I think that's the essence of a cruciform life, a life that looks like the cross, where we die to ourselves for the reconciliation, for someone else's shalom. And so I think that if we, when we think about reconciliation, if we can just acknowledge that it's going to be hard, then also have hope that the same Holy Spirit that empowered Jesus empowers us to have these hard conversations, and empowers us to be reconcilers, and empowers us to be agents of shalom. I think really beautiful things can happen in the church. And so I think that's just my final thought. Yes, it's going to be hard, but we can do hard things with God.
Wow, I feel like I'm in church right now. This has been awesome. Listen to y'all. All right, thanks so much for being a part of our panel discussion tonight. We want to invite you, our audience, to participate in our ongoing conversation around these issues throughout the MennoNerds family. You'll be seeing blog posts and conversations pertaining to tonight's broadcast in the next few days, so keep an eye out. This concludes a special panel presentation from MennoNerds on race, mutuality, and Anabaptist distinctives. Join us in a few weeks as MennoNerds hosts additional panel discussions on important issues facing Anabaptists in the 21st century. I've been your host, Tyler Tully. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.